All right, so now let's talk about symbiotic relationships. So, we saw that in different ecosystems, right? There are different organisms living in the same area, right? And sometimes these organisms they get along well with each other, right? They benefit each other. It's like a mutual relationship where they help each other. There are some relationships between certain species that where one of them benefits from the other, and the other one isn't harmed, right? And then there's another one where one of them benefits from the relationship and one of them is harmed by the relationship, right? So again, there's some where they mutually benefit each other, right? They're good for each other. And then there's some where the relationship is good for one and it doesn't hurt or help the other one. But then there's the one again where you have one that gets helped by the relationship and the other one gets hurt by the relationship. Right. And so we'll see these right here. And all these pictures are kind of examples of symbiotic relationships. Right. So symbiotic relationships, just break down the word, right? Symbiosis is, the definition first, right? The relationship between two different individual species that live together in a close relationship. Right. So remember, species, y'all, are different type of organisms, right? Humans are one species, dogs are another, cats are another, bees are another, certain bacteria, right? But we all live together in a close relationships with the things that we do live near, right? And so the word symbiosis can be broken down into two parts, right, to determine its meaning. And that's the thing about biology, all and other sciences, is you kind of have to try to break down the words to understand them. Right, so sim means together. So when you see that word sim, it means together, right? And this is what we're talking about: different species living together. And when you're talking about bio means life, right? So symbiosis is living things living together, right? And so this is what we're talking about with symbiosis. But again, we're going to focus on three different types of symbiotic relationships. So each one of these, I kind of explained them like in the first slide, but you can also use identify the relationships using these positive or negative or even a zero sign, right? So positive usually means that it's good for the species. Minus means it is harmful, and then zero means it's just neutral. It's not harmful or it's not helpful, right? So let's go ahead and start with, and again, these are the three types of symbiotic relationships. Mutualism, that is positive for both sides, right? It's a plus plus for both of the species involved. When you have commensalism is positive and then neutral. So that plus sign means it's good for one of them. That zero means it doesn't hurt and it doesn't harm the other one, right? It's neutral. But then you have parasitism, right? Parasitism, that's the word parasite, right? And so that just means that a parasite is helped by the relationship, but the host or whatever the parasite is benefiting from is harmed by the relationship, right? I always think of ticks when I think about these, like ticks on a dog or on any animal, right? They're sucking the blood out of them and hurting it. They're harming the animal, but they're feeding themselves, right? So we're going to focus on these in more detail and give you some examples of mutualism, which is a positive positive, which is good for both. Commensalism, which is positive neutral, so it's good for one and it doesn't hurt and it doesn't help the other. And then parasitism, it's good for one but it harms the other. Right, so let's look at those in a little bit more detail. So mutualism, right? The acacia galls are homes to stinging ants, right? And the ants defend acacia from other insects that would harm the tree leaves, right? So the ants get a place to live and they get some food. And the acacia trees, they get protectors from other animals that would want to come eat the leaves, right? It looks like they have some thorns, some pretty thick thorns there. But if an animal was able to get past those thorns and start eating the leaves, then these ants would come out and get all over the animal and attack it. And then animals learn, hey, don't eat these leaves anymore, right? So for this one right here, this is mutualism, a relationships where both organisms benefit, right? The home and the food for the ant, and then the protection for the tree. And this is a plus plus relationship, right? It's positive for both of the species, the ant species and the tree species. Think of a normal friendship where both friends gain something from the friendship, right? That's the kind of friendship you want to have, is where both people benefit from that relationship. Another example of mutualism, which is a plus plus, the moray eel, right? It's that bigger thing. It gets its mouth cleaned by that little cleaner fish, right? That little cleaner fish is in there cleaning up its mouth, and the little cleaner fish is getting food, right? And so the eel gets some clean mouth, and the little fish gets some food. Mutualism of flowers and their pollinators, right? So that's one thing that happens is that there's a male flower and a female flower, right? So the male flower has to get its pollen on the female flower in order for that flower to make seeds and have more, if you want to call them babies, but right, to have more little plants, right? So what happens is that these flowers provide food for the bee and the hummingbird, and then the hummingbird and the bee, they go from flower to flower to flower, spreading all of that pollen onto the flowers, right? So it's getting food. The bird and the bee is getting food. It's funny, birds and the bees, they're getting the food, but they are also passing along the pollen to other flowers and allowing those flowers to have seeds and then to grow, right? So it's positive for the bird and the bee, and it's positive for the flowers. Same thing with us, or even like us, right? We were seeing birds and mammals. We're mammals. We eat berries and fruits while the plant benefits by the dispersal of seeds. So that's kind of like the reason why plants have evolved sweet fruits, right? So the other animals can go and eat those fruits. And then when they leave their droppings, right, they eat them and then they digest. And then wherever they leave their droppings, that's where the seeds, they already have that built-in fertilizer, right? So then those seeds will get passed on to different places and they will grow other plants, right? And so this is kind of passing along its seeds and for the plants, and then the animals get to eat, right? So they both benefit each other. The oxbird right here. So you see the oxbird and you see that little bird. Sorry, see the, what is this? A deer, oh, an antelope. I'm sorry. The antelope here, and then the little oxbird by its ear. So the oxbird gets rid of the parasites. All right, so here we have the oxbird, which is a little bird right there, and then we have the antelope, right, which is the bigger guy, kind of looks like a deer. And so the oxbird gets rid of the parasites, right? So if it has ticks, the little oxbird will go and it will eat all of those ticks. It'll clean the antelope, right? So the antelope gets those parasites removed off of its body, whereas the oxbird will get some food. And so this right here works for both of them, right? So this is a plus plus mutualism. And so here's an example of something that you might see on the STAR exam that relates to what we're talking about. Right. So which of these best demonstrates mutualism between certain types of bacteria and humans? Right. And that's something else that is important to talk about, right? Us and our bacteria. I read somewhere that we have more bacteria cells in our body than we do actually like human cells, right? And so we have tons of bacteria in our body and on our body. Most of it is not going to harm us, right? And some of it is even beneficial to us. But once you get the wrong kind of bacteria or you get too much of a certain type of bacteria, then it can be harmful, right? But for the most part, we're good with our bacteria. And so this question right here, which of these best demonstrates mutualism between certain types of bacteria and humans? So you just have to remember, mutualism is a positive, right? So it's got to be good for both of the species involved. In this case, bacteria and humans. So which do you think? So when we're still talking about mutualism, right, many herbivores such as cows, sheep, deer, horses, rabbits depend on bacteria, right? That's what I was just saying, that live in their stomachs to break down the plant material, right? So again, a lot of us have bacteria, which is not going to harm us. It is mutually beneficial to us, right? Which means it's beneficial to the bacteria and to the people. All right, so we've been talking about mutualism. Now we're going to move on to commensalism. Right, so commensalism is a relationship where one species benefits while the other species remains unaffected. Right, so this is that plus zero, or the positive and the zero. The positive is because it's beneficial to one, and the zero is that it doesn't affect the other one. It's not positive or negative. Right, so one example here that we see is the barnacles adhering to the skin of a whale. Right, so right here you see that the barnacles, they're kind of like these little shell looking things, and they will stick themselves onto the skin of a whale, right? But they don't really harm the whale, right? They don't like suck its blood, they don't take its nutrients, they hang out there, right? So this is an example right here of the barnacles. They get a place to live, which is a positive for them, but for the whale, nothing happens to it, so it's considered a zero. Right. So this is kind of like a friendship where one of the friends benefits while the other one doesn't change, right? Maybe you have some friends like this. They don't hurt you, but they also don't help you, but they're there to amuse you, things like that. That's kind of what you can think of with this. A positive for one and kind of a zero for the other one. What I would say though is that if it gets to be too much, like if a whale gets over populated by these barnacles, right? If there's just tons of them everywhere, then it's going to hurt its ability to like swim freely, right? So I would say up to a certain point it doesn't harm the whale. But if you get too many barnacles on there, it may do some harm to the whale. So, in another example of commensalism is when one species uses a second organism for housing, right? And sometimes you see this with mammals or birds. They live in holes in the trees, or sometimes orchids will also live in the trees, right? So, not just animals, but plants too. And you see this right here with the orchids. And I like orchids, they're really colorful flowers. And so you see that with these, right? They're living inside the tree and they're not harming the tree. They're not sucking the nutrients away from the tree. They're just there using it as like a house, right? Same thing with the owl. The owl isn't there like eating away the wood like a termite would, and it's not sucking the nutrients out of there like some parasites would. It's just using that hollowed out tree as a home, right? And so it's not doing any damage to the tree, but it is a positive for the owl because it's got a place to live. It's got shelter, right? So plus for the owl, plus for the orchids, the flowers, and zero for the trees, right? Because the trees aren't being helped, but they're also not being harmed. Commensalism right here. The buffaloes stir up insects as they eat grass, and the birds hang around and eat the insects, right? So the birds, they're not like sucking the blood from the buffalo here, and the buffalo aren't being harmed by that. They're not being helped, right? But the buffalo are eating grass, and as they eat the grass, all these insects are flying up, and those birds are catching them and eating them. Right. Sometimes that happens when you mow your lawn, or sometimes after a rain. Right. You'll see all of these bugs coming up out of the ground and all these birds just kind of hanging out there, right, eating those insects that are coming up. But in this case, the buffalo is not being harmed or not being helped, so it's a zero. And for the bird, it's getting some food, so it's a plus for those birds. Here you have Nemo, right? This clownfish. And this clownfish, it gets protection from the sea anemone. And so that sea anemone, right, those greenish looking things, those are actually, they can sting, right? This fish does not get affected by it, so it does not get stung. But what is happening here is this fish is getting protection from those little green sea anemones, right? So again, the fish gets protection. So it's a plus for the fish, for this clownfish. But for the sea anemone, it's not a positive. It's not a negative, right? It's not like this fish is going to start eating that anemone, and it's not like the it's going to give food to the anemone, right? So it's not doing anything for the anemone. So it's zero for the anemone and a positive for the clownfish. Some more commensalism here. You see this big shark, and then there's this little remora kind of hanging at the bottom of its mouth. So the shark eats, and the remora gets the scraps left by the shark. Right. So this remora is not sucking the blood out of the shark. It's not hurting it. It's just kind of hanging out there. Right. So for the shark, it's a zero. It's not helping it. It's not hurting it. So the shark gets a zero. But it is a positive for that remora because that remora is eating the scraps. Right. That the shark is kind of dropping from its mouth. So positive for the remora, a zero for the shark. So this is something that you may get asked on the STAR test, or even like on a midterm or final. Which of these describes commensalism? Remember, plus zero, positive for one, not hurting or helping the other. A tapeworm enters the digestive system of a human and consumes the nutrients in the intestines so that they are not available to the humans. Right. So you just got to ask yourself, well, is this positive? If you see that there is showing some kind of negativity, something is bad for one of them, right away, you know, this cannot be commensalism because commensalism doesn't hurt someone. Right. So if you see that there's a harmful effect, then right away, you know, this cannot be commensalism. Let's see the second one. A cattle egret follows, and an egret is a bird, right? Cattle egret follows cattle around and eats insects disturbed by the movement of the cattle, but the cattle are unaffected, right? So again, you just have to read those. And does one of these show like a negative consequence to one of the species, right? Is something bad happening to one of them? And if the answer is no, nothing bad's happening to either of them, then that's a good sign that it's commensalism, right? Because remember, commensalism is a plus and a zero. So if you ever see a negative thing there, you know right away, hey, this is not commensalism. All right, so now let's talk about the other one. Remember, commensalism was it's positive for one, and it's neutral for the other one, right? It's a zero for the other, a plus and a zero. But parasitism, as you can see with the little emojis here, one of them is happy, the other one is sad, right? So that's kind of like a positive and a negative. Whenever you see the happy, think positive. Whenever you see the sad face, think negative, right? And so here, parasitism is a relationship where one organism benefits, right? The parasite benefits, while the species it depends on is a host, it's harmed, right? So this is not good for one of these species in the relationship. The host is an organism on which a parasite lives, right? So if you're talking about fleas or ticks, then the host would be like a dog, right? The host is the one that the ticks feed off of. And so this is that positive negative relationship, right? You can see right here on the right, there's a parasitic isopod on the fish. So that isopod is that little bluish purple thing you see, and it's stuck to that fish, and it is just sucking the nutrients out of whatever that whatever that fish has within its body. That bluish purple isopod is sucking that out of the fish, right? Eventually, if it's a well-adapted parasite, it'll just eat enough to keep living so that its host doesn't die, right? But sometimes it gets out of hand and the parasite will kill the host, right? And this is where you can think of a friendship where you might feel used by your friend, right? You're doing everything and they're just kind of reaping all the benefits. And so here's some examples right here, which I really hate looking at these pictures. Ticks and fleas that live in a host animal's fur, they bite the animal and they drink its blood, right? So these are parasites. They bother the animal, it causes itching, it can cause disease, and eventually if it gets enough ticks on it, it can cause death, right? And there are diseases that it spreads like Lyme disease. And so again, this is a positive for the tick, but it is negative for the animal. Parasitism, right? Mistletoe, whenever we have Christmas, people will kiss under the mistletoe. That's a tradition. But mistletoe is actually a parasite, right? It takes the moisture and nutrients from the trees while the woody plant has to support itself and the mistletoe, right? So again, it's taking all of those nutrients from its host and it's feeding itself, right? So it's damaging the host by stealing its food, but it is helping itself by feeding itself, right? So it's kind of like a tick, but on a tree, right? The plant version of a tick. And so here, I hate these guys too, right? Insects such as mosquitoes feeding on a host, they are parasites, right? They do nothing for us. They do nothing positive for us, but they drink our blood. And in some places, they spread diseases, right? Luckily, we kind of got those in check here, but there are some countries where the diseases that the mosquitoes spread are they run rampant, right? They're all over the place. They pass them around very easily. And so, yeah, in this case, we would be the host and the mosquitoes are the parasite. So also plants, right? We've been talking a lot about, well, we kind of saw the mistletoe, but always consider plants can also be parasites, right? Vines such as a kudzu growing on trees. And you see this here even in the US. There are some places where you go to and vines like these have already like taken over big chunks of the forest, right? So these guys, they take over the land, they take over the trees, they block out the sun. And remember, plants get their food from the sun, right? So they grow over that, they start taking up all the space. They're basically taking the food away from these plants, but they're getting all of that food from the sunlight, right? So some species like this, they call them invasive, and that means that they take over areas. They don't naturally belong there, but someone brings it there, someone accidentally releases something there, and all of a sudden they take over because there's nothing to stop them from taking over. Tomato hornworms with wasp eggs. Yeah, you can see right here, these guys, they will feed on the worm, but then they also lay their eggs on top of it. And then when their eggs hatch, then they feed off of those caterpillars too, right? So it is a parasite in every like sense of the word. These guys too, all these parasites kind of, I don't really want to spend too much time on them because they're gross, right? As a potential host, like we really don't like parasites too much in general. And so the tapeworm it attaches itself to the intestines of a dog, and the tapeworm takes nutrients from the dog, right? So if there is a tapeworm there and it doesn't get taken care of, they keep growing and growing and growing, and the dog keeps losing all of its nutrients, and the food that it eats is not as effective to keep it energized and to keep it healthy because this tapeworm is stealing all of its food.